The author of The Art of War, Sun Tzu, once wrote, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." We live in an age of fifth-generation information warfare. Battles are not solely fought with guns and bombs. The new battlefield is in the mind of every citizen to control your thoughts. There are covert psychological operations at play to control what you see, what you hear, and what you're allowed to think. Here on Fallout, our new epochtv show, co-hosted by myself and my good friend Jan Jekielek, we'll be looking at radical policies that have transformed Western societies and the multifaceted consequences of these policies. And we'll also examine lifestyle choices that you can make to opt out of the system. So Jan, when you think about it, advertising and propaganda are really the same thing. And as folks that have grown up in the West over the last few decades, we've seen the growth of advertising technology, the increasing sophistication to sell us boxes of soap and loaves of bread. But as it's been deployed and evolved, we've all learned to see it and see through it. So we become more immune to the tech. We need to learn to do the same thing with fifth generation warfare.
Well, so I gotta ask, how do you define fifth generation warfare?
Neither of us are experts in fifth generation warfare. We've both been subjected to it for years now. And we've kind of had a learn on the job experience as we've been on the receiving end of it. And it's really a phrase that's used to describe the most modern, highly developed aspect of the gradient of warfare that starts with sticks and stones, goes through battle lines and tank warfare, to asymmetric warfare where you have a non-state actor essentially being a guerrilla force against a state. And now in the modern embodiment where fifth generation warfare is this world in which propaganda and psychological operations, the deployment of psychological technology on people to convince them of a narrative has become increasingly the mainstay of modern warfare.
You know, and the thing that I find most disturbing about all of this is that it's actually, people just have decided that it's a moral thing to do this in the first place.
We're now in a world in which governments are justifying the active use of this technology against their own citizens. This is tech that was developed for offshore combat, but now is being deployed against the citizenry. And often, of course, these people try to redirect blame for what's going on to other parties. This gets to this point of, it's another key characteristic of fifth generation warfare. When it's properly performed, you are unable to see who is behind it. The receiver of the information, essentially the subject of the warfare that's being manipulated, is completely unaware of who's doing it to them.
You know, I've been saying that I think this is truly one of the defining issues of our times. And as many viewers of American Thought Leaders know, I've been talking a lot about this, the ability of this structure now to manufacture the perception of consensus, and how powerful that is actually for affecting people's behavior and actually believing what is true and what isn't. So, you know, why don't we do this first episode? In this first episode, why don't we actually talk about some of the tools that are being employed, looking at, you know, actually some of the official tools in the toolkit of the US military.
There was this fascinating recent report from the House Committee on Weaponization of Government and the Judiciary, in which staffers reported on CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and its activities. And what they documented is that during the COVID crisis and even before and since, with agendas like climate change, the government has deployed the same exact technologies that they have been claiming other individual or state actors have been deploying against the US government to manipulate information. What CISA has done on their website, cisa.gov, is to lay out a series of examples of how information warfare or mis and dis and malinformation are used by third parties to craft and manipulate what people are thinking and feeling. And what I found fascinating when I read this is that, to my eye, these things that CSIA is listing are actually what are being used against us by the government, and not just the US government, but virtually all of the Five Eyes governments, the UK, Canada, US, New Zealand, and Australia. These same techniques are being actively deployed against citizens.
So while you're on that, I just want to mention, let's just define these really quickly for people, because the malinformation part, a lot of people don't even understand that concept. The idea that information that's actually true, that goes against the correct prescribed narratives that the government is putting out. That's just a bizarre term to me.
Yeah, it's totally Orwellian. So misinformation is information which is inconsistent with the approved narrative from the United States or some designated third party like World Health Organization. But it isn't being spread for political purposes. It just is different from the approved narrative. Disinformation is misinformation which is being deployed for political purposes. So if I'm spreading a different narrative than the approved one, and I'm doing it because I want to get somebody elected or advance some political agenda, then that's disinformation. As you mentioned, malinformation is completely Orwellian. That's information that someone is spreading, which might cause discomfort or problems with the government because it's contrary to their approved narrative, but it's actually true. So the first two are untrue information according to the government. The third one can be true information according to the government, but the government doesn't want it shared. So one example of this technology that CISA lists are people who cultivate fake or misleading personas and websites. So we see this all the time. We call them bots and trolls, bot armies, etc. And we can see intentionally fake information being placed on websites. This is one of the reasons why Russia Times is often suspect. And I think there's a number of the kind of activity associated with the CCP.
Well, so there's, of course, a lot of people are familiar with the concept of the 50-cent army. So we have tens of thousands of people who are paid a little tiny amount per post pushing government narratives, basically, or CCP narratives.
Yeah, and in the UK we have the 77th Brigade, which is loosely affiliated with their military and is paid. So you have common people sitting in their apartment getting their ration from the government to post stuff on the internet that serves government interests in the UK. And this is really true. It's been documented that we've had this kind of activity happening with most of these governments now. Epoch Times did a great piece where they documented, because of Freedom of Information Act, the Foundation for CDC using this type of approach of surrogate armies, essentially gang stalking, funded through the Foundation for the CDC to the public good projects to shots heard around the world, which would then notify an army of influencers on social media to go attack this person or that person or try to defeat this or that narrative. So there's lots of examples.
So in gang stalking, just for the benefit of our audiences, that's when a whole bunch of people pile on to a particular person, sort of extreme bullying from a large group of people.
Yep. There's another one now, synthetic media, that's come to fore. And that's particularly intriguing, and I think we're going to see a lot of it in this next election cycle. Here we are in 2024 now, where this artificial intelligence technology, and there's old school deep fakes and synthetic media also, where people just use Adobe Photoshop and edit things on past tweets, etc., I've experienced this where people create synthetic tweets and then circulate it out as an effort to delegitimize me.
And just for the record, synthetic media, I've only heard that term fairly recently, right? But it's basically something that really looks like, for example, an official epochTimes post that someone screenshotted, but it's been modified to tell a false story, right? But it has that feeling of credibility.
So the first time I encountered a deep fake was an advertising campaign that a company in the UK performed, in which they cloned my voice, and then they edited a video that I had cut with Great Britain News, so that it was modifying the movement of my lips to comport with their false narrative that they put using my voice, in which I was advertising for a medical device that I'd never even heard of before. And that was still fairly crude. You could see through it. But my understanding is that technology is now developed to the point where you can have people, well, here's an example. I know of a rapper who is getting great traction creating rap songs for Donald Trump, in which Donald Trump is singing the song. He's doing the rapping, and it's entirely fake and synthetic through use of artificial intelligence. This is just the very front edge of what's coming at us.
Well, just with one caveat, like he's not pretending that's actually Donald Trump doing the singing, right?
True.
Whereas here with these deep fakes, I mean, these things can have a profound impact on us, right?
Yeah.
So when you see someone saying something, even if you get this cognitive dissonance, someone will tell you, this is a deep fake, this isn't real, but hey, I just saw that person say it.
Yeah, it's really powerful, and it gets straight into your brain. Another example involves the development and amplification of conspiracy theories. This gets really twisted. The weaponization of conspiracy theories in order to divide communities and delegitimize bona fide, typically resistant movements. Mm-hmm. So you may have a resistance movement that is focused on this, that, or the other thing that the government happens to be doing at this point in time, or whatever the agenda is, or globalism, or climate change, or whatever. And within that, actors can come in and either create synthetically or promote conspiracy theories within that area. Then often they'll gather followers because it's confirming the conspiracy beliefs that that general community may have, and drive them towards a position that is absolutely not credible.
So, this conspiracy theory term has been getting so much traction to the point where it's even unclear. Like people say, yesterday's conspiracy theory is today's conspiracy fact, right? Like sort of almost all of them.
What's the time log on conspiracy theories being validated?
Right. So conspiracy theory is, I mean, that itself is a kind of Orwellian term because there's plenty of conspiracies, but the implication is that every conspiracy is somehow, tainted with misinformation, right?
The injecting of that term into the national dialogue was actually promoted by the CIA after the Kennedy assassination. So before then, you don't see that term used in common discourse or in journalism. But it was intentionally inserted as part of this Operation Mockingbird activity that happened, that the CIA has been involved in for since mid-century, since its founding.
And let me just jump in on Operation Mockingbird, because that might, a lot of people might be familiar, but this is, Operation Mockingbird was disclosed, I think, in the church report. Basically, it's CIA operatives are working in the media. In some cases, the media owners actually know that they're agents. In other cases, they don't.
There's a famous quote that was used in this context, that it's cheaper to buy a journalist than it is to buy a prostitute. They employed a huge range of mainstream journalists. By the way, they also employed a lot of academics, but that was kind of downplayed in the church report. So there's this long-standing integration of the CIA into reporting in corporate media that, as I said, it goes back to mid-century. It goes back to the founding of the CIA, and it still continues to this day. People think that it was stopped after the Church Commission, but that's not actually what, I think it was Colby that was the director at the time, and then Bush. They didn't actually prohibit it. What they did is they said, well, we're no longer going to support basically the main journalists, and they had this, Bernstein documented over 200 mainstream journalists working for the New York Times, etc., that were masthead people. We're no longer going to do that, but we will continue to support I think the slang is the stringers, people that write the articles that then get placed. They don't always have their name at the masthead, etc. So the CIA has absolutely continued this activity. And now it's not just the CIA, but it's FBI, it's the entire, you really have to think about the intelligence ecosystem in the United States. It's not just one agency.
Well, and there's another sort of confounding element here, right? Because, for example, looking back to the Obama administration, right? Manufacturing the perceived consensus around the Iran deal. That
Absolutely.
was, so Ben Rhodes actually disclosed in great detail how he did that. But the journalists were willing participants, ostensibly, right? And sort of because they were ideologically on board. And this has been a theme, I think, for multiple events, including Russiagate and so forth, since that time.
So another example is astroturfing and flooding the information environment. This is another way to control the narrative and control what people are thinking, because when they see all these posts or information, like here's a great example that you'll see again and again, is someone within mainstream media will decide that they're going to attack somebody or some organization or some topic area. And then you'll see kind of a pile-on effect where suddenly you'll see derivative articles come out in a flood, all coordinated off, through corporate media. So this is flooding the zone, and it also happens in social media, where these bot and troll armies and other activities will come in when there has been a new disclosure, a new bit of information that is not in the interests of whatever the current approved narrative is. Then you'll see often a whole lot of commentators suddenly come in. They usually have the characteristics of, I call it low complexity. They're often new accounts. They have few connections, few followers, but they'll flood the zone with alternative versions of whatever the narrative is that's just been disclosed. So people are completely confused. They don't know what to believe. One example is the safe and effective and don't kill grandma narratives that we heard associated with the COVID crisis. Another one is this messaging about Trump being an authoritarian and that he's going to be a dictator. I mean, when that first was kind of piloted out, you suddenly saw a flood of articles in corporate media all talking about Trump as a potential dictator and authoritarian.
Well, and when that is done in, I guess in an extreme way for a long period of time, you get what we call colloquially Trump derangement syndrome in people. And some people have gotten, or, as far as I can tell, they're just kind of broken this way. They've just come to believe structurally that this is true.
Yeah, so this is partially neurolinguistic programming, which is a key component of how this cyber propaganda operates. When you repeat something again and again and again and again, it gets into your brain. It gets in a fundamental way. You assimilate it and you no longer question it because you're hearing it from so many different, what appear to be independent voices, but often they're coordinated.
Well, so, and this what I would argue is probably the most powerful tool, the combination of, I guess this corporate media narrative being seeded, and then this, all these ostensibly independent small accounts amplifying and validating. And that is, I don't know if that's the only way, but it's such a powerful way in which this perceived consensus is manufactured. And I mean, I would have never guessed, going back 3 years personally, I had no idea that this was possible or doable. And we've seen it, I think, multiple times now in, Trump, COVID, multiple scenarios. BLM is a great example.
So another one of the technologies that's used in this fifth gen warfare that's laid out by CISA, but also deployed apparently by CSA, is the abuse of alternative platforms. And this is really problematic, because we're all in favor of free speech, right? You want free speech, I want free speech. Epoch Times is about free speech. It's about getting to the truth and speaking truth. And now X ostensibly is endorsing free speech, even though they have an underlying policy of freedom of speech but not of reach. But there are some platforms that are completely open and committed to free speech, and some of them have biases. One of those is Gab, and another one is Substack. And to just focus on Gab for a minute, Gab has a complete tolerance of, for example, anti-Semitism. And what you see on Gab is the abuse of that platform. And I think a lot of it is directed. I think that one of the strategies that is deployed on Gab is false voices, these artificial accounts that promote really rabid anti-Semitism statements. And what it does is it kind of normalizes anti-Semitism within that platform.
And if you tolerate, if you don't kind of quickly get rid of them or something like that, then the bad actor can say, "Hey, you're actually responsible because you endorse this.
Yeah,
you support
you can
it, right?"
you can be accused of endorsing it just because you don't delete it or don't speak out against it. So that's a great example, and it illustrates the problem. We're all in favor of free speech, and yet these really ugly narratives can be aggressively injected and weaponized in ways, including to delegitimize people intentionally.
Right.
So in this bizarre, twisting landscape of fifth-generation warfare, you never really know what's real. You never really know who is acting and why and what their real agenda is. And of course, that's all by intention.
And this is, one of the reasons why at Epoch Times we take a bit longer sometimes to kind of figure things out, I think, because it's really hard to sift through what's true and what's false and what's been planted. And we've seen a lot of that, frankly, to later to discredit you, right?
So precisely. I think one of the most amazing examples, you remember the New York Times headline when that hospital got hit with a rocket attack in Gaza. And first they were blaming the Israelis, and then the narratives changed, and they were so quick to jump into the approved narrative that they got the story wrong. And then they had to flip their headlines when they found out what the true information was, sometimes going a little bit slower, particularly in true journalism, is important. And it's one of the problems when we get locked into this nanosecond news cycle on X and these other platforms, is that often the narrative can develop and run away before it's actually been validated. But that can be used and weaponized. Another example that CISA points out is the spreading of targeted content by third parties. And the way this thing works is if you can find somebody who has a fairly large following on the social media platform and get them to retweet your content or repost it, then it goes out to a much larger audience than you yourself might have had access to.
Something very enticing, something very attractive, obviously. Right?
And I got caught up in this once myself. If you'll recall, there was a video that was very compelling back when everybody was talking about died suddenly, these sudden death events associated often with young men in sporting events. And there was a compilation that was quite compelling about this, showing all these video clips of young men dying on sports fields. And when I saw it, I thought that it was bona fide and was a great example illustrating the point, and so I reposted it. And that then got amplified. I thought nothing more of it, until 2 months later I got a cease and desist letter from the parents of one of the young men portrayed in this video, who it turns out had died suddenly on the field before COVID ever happened, before 2019. And so I had inadvertently caused pain to these parents without even realizing it. I had no idea that that particular clip was even in the montage. It was just one of many. Yeah. But that's a great example of where you can, if you're not careful about what you're reposting, you can inadvertently be used to spread false content, and then that in turn can be weaponized against you.
Absolutely. I've also, even I have a much smaller following, I've also learned to be, very, very careful of this. And this is just scratching the surface. These are just like the official tools that we are being pointed at. And as you mentioned, right, this is a robust, growing discipline, academic discipline, as we speak, with huge amounts of money being thrown at it.
Rapidly evolving. All these techniques are evolving in real time on social media. We're both watching it happen. It's being deployed against us. It's being deployed against me, against epochtimes, against my physician colleagues. And we're learning at the same time those that are deploying these kinds of mis and disinformation strategies are learning about how to do it better, how to better manipulate the public.
You know, Robert, as we finish up here, I can't help but remember this Ghost in the Machine recruiting video that is a bona fide military recruitment video that I think kind of recounts a little bit of, you know, what we've just been talking about today.
Yeah, I first found that clip, it's over a year ago now, and I've used it in a lot of my fifth generation warfare lectures. It really shocks people when they watch it because often they're not aware that it's a recruiting video. This is coming from the Fort Bragg Ghost Army group, which is the main information warfare group within the formal U.S. Army. And then there are a whole bunch of them in Army Reserve spread across the United States. This is a group that was overseen by the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, when he was a lieutenant general, and which put out the current official U.S. military SIWAR manual, which was signed off by now Secretary of Defense, back when he was in command of that base, and which authorizes the military to deploy this SIWAR technology on American citizens in the event of a national emergency, which is clearly what we've experienced over the last 3 years. And what we've seen, because of FOIAs and journalistic work, etc., is that the militaries of certainly the Great Britain, the United States, Canada, and it appears also New Zealand and Australia, have likewise deployed their own SIWAR or fifth generation warfare technologies against their own citizens. So this video I love. It shocks people when they watch it. They have no idea what they're walking into. And it's trying to recruit young members into the military to join this particular operation, which again, the Secretary of Defense in recent statements has said this is the future of warfare.